This is Jim Jennings. I'm an architect in San Francisco, California, and you are listening to U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. Woodward Woodie Garber was a modernist architect, and he'd be a household name if your household was in Cincinnati. He died in 1994, and it took 24 years for our guest, daughter Elizabeth Garber, to write Implosion, a memoir of an architect's daughter. Later on, we'll spend a few minutes with Frank Harmon, author of Native Places. And now, from quarantine, deep in a hermetically sealed house, only allowed to drive through Starbucks late at night right before they close, here's your host, George Smart.
Hi, folks. How's everybody doing? Did you think the pandemic would be over, say, by May? And here it is, fall. We are half a year in with lots of uncertainty ahead and boredom. I don't know about you, but I've pretty much come to the end of my to-do list. I've fixed broken doors, replaced grill parts, donated old clothes, scanned hundreds of my mom's 35mm faded slides, washed and dried and cleaned and fixed and painted. And there's only so much Netflix you can watch.
Amen.
We had to replace our cable equipment too, and to save some money, I got a Roku, which you can substitute for one of those converter boxes that Spectrum charges you out the wazoo for each month. It's not too bad once you figure out how to turn the Roku off, which is the hardest part. They hide the off switch, I guess in part to keep you watching. My new guilty pleasure using the Roku is a long-running show on Adult Swim called Robot Chicken. If you like sketch comedy, this is far and away the funniest series going. Back in the day, you could count on Saturday Night Live to throw out a genius bit every week, but we've not seen much of that other than political comedy since the 1990s, with the exception of Dave Chappelle and Key and Peele. Like swing dancing, where a beautiful person falls into your arms every 3 minutes, Robot Chicken speeds along with sketches that last from a few seconds to maybe 3 or 4 minutes. Creator Seth Green and his team created several Robot Chicken Star Wars parodies, which are hilarious, right up there with Family Guy. The sketch where an ashamed Darth Vader has to tell the Emperor that a bunch of teenagers just blew up the Death Star is priceless. Adult Swim is also available on most cable channel lineups. Support for U.S. Modernist Radio comes from Modernist realtor Angela Roll.
In a timeless adventure that we are largely making up, realtor Angela Roll grew up in Switzerland, the daughter of a former hacker wrongly accused of spying for the Russians. An Olympic skier, she skied across the border into France by mistake, causing an avalanche that completely buried the very first French Waffle House.
Much to the disappointment of Jean Nouvel, who designed it but later disavowed it.
At 18, following a career-ending injury involving a little red dress, a wood-turning lathe, Cristal champagne, and a duck, Angela studied architecture by day and partied with Courvoisier's former neighbor, roofer to the stars, Bjarke Shingles, by night. When Bjarke left the lucrative world of celebrity roofing to start a new cheese company, Bjarke Shingles Singles.
Oh my.
Angela decided to pivot,
By far the most overused word of 2020.
to a new career in real estate. As one of the few specialty modernist agents with architecture training, Angela deftly deals with unreasonable sellers, unrealistic buyers, incompetent builders, and slow bureaucrats, while connecting people to the modernist houses of their dreams. And she can get you a great deal on cheese. Modernist realtor Angela Roll is your special agent. Reach her at angelaroll.com. That's ROEHL or 919-995-0550.
Thank you, Tom. Woodie Garber was a modernist architect in Cincinnati, Ohio. The son of architect Frederick Garber, Woodie was called a controversial visionary whose advocacy of uncluttered openness and design grows more influential every year. Woodie was a brilliant independent modernist who wanted things his own way, daring even to refer to Frank Lloyd Wright as Frank Lloyd Wrong. Architecture was not the only controversy in his life. Being married to him, or being his child, was to experience the fury of bipolar disorder, coupled with a desire to control everything and everyone in his path. There was a lot to process on so many levels. His daughter, Elizabeth Garber, is a poet, an author, and acupuncturist, with degrees from Johns Hopkins and the University of Southern Maine. She's also the poet laureate of Belfast. That's Maine, not Ireland. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Hi. This is great to be with you and have this conversation.
Your early childhood with your adoring dad was a magical journey into architecture. Tell us about that special early time. I saw that you had posted some great photos of you in a Sarnen womb chair.
Right. I grew up with sort of the focus of our life was modernism, and it was just sort of the air that we lived in. As a child, I'd go on jobs that he was building. We'd look at Corbusier books together. We'd look at modern sculpture. I didn't know that there were realistic paintings. I only thought there were abstract paintings until I went to other people's houses. We had Kandinsky on the walls and Bertoia sculptures, and what I really appreciate is what an opportunity for a child to immerse themselves in a complex language. It's like someone growing up as an apprentice to someone, and I felt like I grew up immersed in modernism and getting that language and that understanding about buildings, and I love the words. You know, as a little kid, you like big words, so I just love cantilever or hyperbolic paraboloid.
Oh, my.
Yes, one of our favorites, too.
Right. I just thought I was the coolest kid to be able to say that. So it's an interesting thing that there's a way that when you're an adoring child and you give all your attention, and that there's such an ease with a parent. But when you start having your own mind and start going through adolescence and teen rebellion, suddenly everything changed.
Did your two brothers take to architecture like you did?
They didn't. They were, I think, as the eldest, and then my first brother was born 3 years later, and then a year later I had a little sister who was sick and then died 2 years later. So my mother was totally involved with babies and kids, so I would go along with my dad as sort of his special companion. And my brothers never got all that immersion in architecture. It was like he and I had that special conversation between us. And my brothers were then just playing with trucks and cars and blocks. And we did have, my dad designed this toy for Kenner Toys, GUD sticks. Grid and panel, something like that. It was this toy where you could build modernist buildings with plastic structures.
How did I miss this?
So they built with blocks, and they were into cars, and they shared that with my dad because my dad had raced racing cars. But I was the one who really had the conversation about architecture and art that they didn't quite get.
I imagine it must have been fun for your dad to take around to other adults since you could speak the architecture language. Yeah.
He liked to show me off that I could ask, or I had opinions, or I could notice things. And
how old were you at that point?
Well, I think I was about 6 or 7 when I decided my favorite Corbusier house was the Villa Savoie à Poissy. And not many 7 or 8-year-olds know their favorite Corbusier house by that point.
I've noticed, yeah.
No, they know their favorite Barbie dream house.
When I was on my book tour and I was in Cincinnati, I met someone who my dad had designed one of their houses, and my dad had required of the owner that he gave him a list of books that he had to read. So his son also said, I knew my Corbusier houses as a child because your dad required it for us to live in the house. So it wasn't only me. And then it was so cool in 8th grade building a professional architectural model of that Corbusier house with my dad. It was just like, it was so cool. How many kids get to do something like that with their dad? And I remembered that day so vividly, and it was an amazing thing to write about it and re-remember conversations that we had while we were building it. Like his saying, all right, look at our house compared to this model, and the model and the design of the model was in meters, so I had to compare and measure in feet, and that's when I discovered that my dad had actually designed our own house in Glendale, Ohio, on a metric grid translated into inches and feet. So I learned so much that day. And, when you remember your childhood, I would remember, oh, right, there was this day my dad and I built this model. But in the process of studying the building again, studying the design of it, and remembering that day, I remembered the conversations we had, and then looking at the plans for our house and going, oh, my God, they are so similar. It's almost like a copy. And then I was shocked, right? My dad would copy Corbusier, but then he said, that's what you do in architecture. You study something you really like, and you build something similar, and then you adapt it to your own environment and time, and the weather of Ohio is compared to northern France. And so there was a lot I learned from that day.
When your dad built his house and designed it, did he really intend it as kind of a showcase for what he was doing?
Yeah.
What he wanted to do?
I think it was, he put everything he loved best, and that he wasn't trying to please a client, he was trying to please himself.
Mm-hmm.
But I thought he had designed it and drawn up all the drawings, and when I was on tour, I met with a number of architects who had been young co-ops and then young associates in his office and then moved on, and realizing they were doing the working drawings. It was like, oh, my dad didn't do all of that. He had an office. He had people.
He delegated.
Yeah, he delegated, and it went through several different plans. And also it was really, architects didn't make that much money then. And because
and still don't, largely. Yeah.
Yeah, he was so difficult to work with, that also impacted his income. So the building was made smaller, and some things were concentrated due to expenses. And then he was loaned money by his mentor, who, Miss Mary Johnston, who was a heiress of the Proctor money in Cincinnati, and she had requested that he be the architect on a number of major buildings, and then she helped us be able to build our house. And it really was a stunning, it still is just a stunning, beautiful house. It's had a postmodernist renovation, but I think it works really well with the original design. And then, as the book points out, we lived in it, and we did the finish work.
Was your mom into the house, or was she a reluctant modernist?
She was into the house, and she did so much of the work. But she went along with whatever my dad wanted or required until about the late 60s, and sort of she started having her rebellion against his authoritarian demands at about the same time we started having our rebellion. But we were all into it because it was so exciting, and there were no modern houses where we lived, and traffic would slow down and people would just stare at the house because it was so, especially when it was on a muddy field, it just looked like a spaceship had been plunked down in the middle of everything, this beautiful white austere building. But then after it was landscaped, it filled in beautifully.
And what year was that about?
We broke ground in about 64, 65, and the house was probably finished about 68, 69.
Oh, that took a while.
Yeah, because we moved into it when it was just studs and subfloor and exterior plywood on the outside, and we lived in it under construction for the next year and a half until we built all the cabinets and did all the trim work, and then had the floors were put in, and then we started 5 years of landscaping. So it was a long haul. It was essentially our childhood was
on a construction crew. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But it is spectacular.
One of the themes of your books revolves around a famous dormitory in Cincinnati that your dad designed. Tell us about how that got started.
I remember my dad coming home from the office, and the night that it was clear that he had gotten the commission to design Sander Hall. And he had been involved with the university on a long-term planning, and there were a lot of changes sort of a complex story about that they originally were going to have 4 short, maybe 6-story dorms, and then they needed to concentrate the site, and the university decided they were going to have a 27-story dormitory. And then my dad got the commission to build, and it was right at the beginning of the whole era of mirror glass buildings. And I remember us going around and going to different cities and seeing how the same glass reflected the atmosphere of that city in different ways.
Oh, yeah.
And he was so excited about what it was going to look like in Cincinnati. And it turned out that this mirror glass, Cincinnati has a lot of pollution, and it has Ivorydale, and it had P&G, and it had GE building aircraft for Vietnam. So there was a lot of pollution in the air. So when this building was finally up and the mirror glass was installed, what might have been silvery gray in some other cities became sort of this lovely rose pink. Except there was a woman on the board of the university who hated pink, and she required the glass be turned around or removed, and the building was just an extraordinary example of energy conservation using reflective glass. And also, they were really aware of making sure it couldn't become a fire hazard. So there was individual heating and cooling units for every single dorm section. So when this woman required all the glass to be turned around, they had to re-engineer all the heating and cooling for the building.
So they actually went ahead and did that, turned
They did it.
each
They
pane of...
turned huge sheets of glass were turned around so that they didn't have the energy conservation savings. And then they would show through into the building, so you didn't get the privacy factor either.
Oh, no.
And they charged my dad. His firm was required to pay the cost. And I remember it wasn't until I was doing the research on the building and I read the deposition there was a whole document of the suit against the University of Cincinnati and suing my dad and requiring him to pay it and his fighting back. And they charged him $30,000, which I did the math and looked at equivalent in inflation. It was $250,000 to turn these panels around, and my dad's firm had to pay for it. And I realized that's why my dad refused to pay for me to go to college. He didn't have the money because he had made $100,000 that year, and his firm had to pay the cost. So it was like...
What college was this? The dorm?
This was the University of Cincinnati.
Okay, not a small school. And so somehow this was his fault?
They blamed him because...
They pinned it on him, yeah.
He had shown a sample panel 5 years before, and they said he misrepresented the panel and the color, and they required him to change it, and he...
But they waited until all the panels were up before they did?
They waited until almost all the panels were up, and then they flipped 4 or 5 panels around on different sides, and he could not see the difference. But someone on the board said, we can see the difference. We're going to flip them around. And he said, could you at least keep the panels the way they're designed to be on the southeast wall so you'd get the energy conservation?
Right.
And they said no, and they required all the panels to be flipped. Meanwhile, this had been holding things up, and they were due to open September 1st for the university opening and for students to move in. So it was under a lot of pressure, a lot of overtime. And that is what really pushed my dad over the emotional edge.
Elizabeth, at some point, this idyllic situation with you and your dad shifted as this project shifted too. What happened, and how did your relationship change?
What's interesting is feeling how wound up I get about, and I would hear about this building every night at the dinner table, and it paralleled. So the building was opening in fall of 71. So it's from 68, 69, 70. Those were really tumultuous years in the culture. So my brother was getting long hair. I was growing long hair. I had a black boyfriend. My mother was becoming a feminist. So my father suddenly was embattled at home. It was like he wanted things to be like a Victorian household where his wife obeyed him and his children obeyed him, and we had perfect table manners, and we had dinner at 6 every night when he came down. And it was like suddenly he was embattled against us, like he was embattled against the hippie kids on campus that were having riots, and there was graffiti on the walls, and the police were called the pigs, and then the battle for the building. So it's like the battle against his children paralleled with the culture, with the building. That's why I ended up calling the book Implosion, because the building ended up being imploded 20 years later. And I realized what happened in our family was our family imploded, the culture imploded, and my father imploded. It escalated his being bipolar until he was just in a raging fury at us all the time. So from the adored child to I became seen as a problem child, and he ended up sending my brother and me away to school for a year. And he just announced it at the dinner table, and that ended up being a crazy, wild adventure. That's what my new book is that I'm working on.
So is this when he sent you off to sea?
He sent my brother and me off to sea to a sail training school. He thought it would be like a military sail training school where we would be knocked into shape and learn to obey authority and obey him.
Like boot camp on a boat or something?
Yeah, it ended up being a total hippie school.
Yeah, it actually sounds like it could be fun.
Incredibly dangerous, and we ended up being held hostage in Panama. It was a wild and crazy year. Yeah, that's why there's a whole new book about
Yeah, you could write a book about that.
I know, yeah. I'm going to.
Your dad presented himself as a very liberal progressive, but in fact, he got much more conservative over time.
He did. A lot of people do. And what's interesting is I've talked to these two architects at University of Cincinnati who saw his early work as much more innovative and sort of exciting. And that Sanders Hall, he became less an innovator. But a lot of people get slowly more conservative as they grow up or get older. And in a lot of ways, he thought he was such a radical, but he was still someone who had been raised in a very strict Victorian household, and he still, in a way, ran his household like a Victorian patriarch. Downton
Abbey, yeah.
Yeah, we would look at Vogue magazine, and he would pick out cool outfits for me, but he still wanted obedience, and he saw sort of the hippies as being absolutely anathema to his values and the way he thought people should be.
You studied Greek epics in the mythology and folklore department at Harvard, which I didn't even know was a department.
Yeah,
your story really seems like a Greek epic, and the book reads like one.
When I was working on this book, one of my mentors said, "No wonder you studied mythology, because you lived, in a way, we lived in a house that was like living on Mount Olympus." And my father was really an Odyssean kind of hero. He was a tragic hero. And writing the book helped me realize his life really was a tragedy because of this mental illness that he had so much impassionate excitement about things that were really meaningful and beautiful, and he essentially sort of destroyed his family. He left his home. He ended up living to be an old, isolated old man in a really broken person. But he was still this charismatic, remarkable person, but he injured and hurt a lot of people along the way.
Yeah.
I feel incredible compassion for him. Writing the book, I gained so much more compassionate understanding of what he lived through and how hard he fought for modern architecture. So I came out both really admiring and seeing the ravages of his mental illness in a way I hadn't fully before.
Was your father's bipolar disorder something that emerged as he grew older? Or
he was depressed as a teenager and I think attempted suicide when he was in high school.
Oh, my.
He supposedly erupted in anger a lot with his brothers and his father, and then when he was studying architecture, supposedly he was famous for he and his father would have screaming, raging arguments about architecture. But then when his first marriage ended and his first child and his first wife disappeared, he went into a terrible depression and ended up having shock treatments, and then started working with a psychiatrist who he worked with the rest of his life, or until the psychiatrist died. And the psychiatrist saw him as so brilliant and so creative, he didn't want to give him any medication or anything that would cramp that brilliance. So I feel like we bore the impact of that decision.
Did you get to meet any of that first family?
When I was in my 20s, his daughter returned. She found him. She realized after she had children, she realized the impact of his having lost a child at age 5 or 6, what that meant. And she was like the prodigal daughter. And they had a really lovely connection over the years. She was 10 years older than me, so she returned in her mid-30s. So I'm so glad they had that time together. She lost out on a lot of the bad stuff, too.
Yeah. At one point, your dad took responsibility and acknowledged quite a bit of inappropriate behavior with you.
Yes.
Tell us about that, and then how he kind of took it all back.
Yeah, I've seen this as an acupuncturist, that sometimes when people are dying and their energy is receding, that sometimes people who have wrestled with mental illness, like psychosis or whatever, often become milder or gentler. And out of the blue, about 3 or 4 months before my dad died, he called me up, and it was one of the most extraordinary moments of my life. He said, "I want to know what I did." And it was like, gulp, do I dare say the truth to my dad? And what I did is I went into my professional acupuncture self, and I just was very sort of calm, and I just mapped out different things that had happened. And I said, and then this is sexual abuse, and this is a violation of boundaries. And we weren't allowed to close the bathroom door, because he said Victorians were so extreme, he'd never seen even his mother's ankles, and he'd never seen his mother nude. So he required nudity in our house.
Well,
I said, well, that's a violation of boundaries, and children need to be allowed to have boundaries around their body. And so I just sort of mapped these things out.
so this man that upheld Victorian ideals changed his mind when it came to a fundamental aspect of human privacy.
Right. He didn't believe in privacy. And you live in a glass house. There are no curtains. We did have shades in our bedrooms, but that was only because it was to block the sun. But we used them for privacy because anyone out there in the field could look straight into the house. So that was sort of a young ideal. When we one summer went up camping on an island in Canada, and he required us to be nude, and we all got sunburned.
Oh, my goodness.
I know.
This sounds like a
So
cable TV show we'd be watching nowadays.
Right, with a lot of, blurring.
Yeah.
But the 60s and 70s, there were a lot of artists who, and I've read articles and stories about, there was so much opening up of boundaries that there was a lot of boundarylessness and a lot of abuse of children. There was this guy who was a photographer who photographed his daughter's breasts every year, and my father did photographs of my brother and me when we were nude because he wanted to see how we grew stronger on the ship. It was just...
Yeah.
So it built up a lot of rage in my brothers and me.
And so your dad, in that conversation, did he fully acknowledge he had done something bad?
He said he had never meant to hurt me ever. And then he was shocked. He said, "Why did you have anything to do with me if you thought things this way?" And I said, "Because I loved you." And I kept trying to figure out how to have a sane, healthy relationship. Also, when you grow up with those values around nudity and lack of privacy, you think that's the way it is it wasn't until I started learning about child abuse and violation of privacy and in my 30s and 40s that I realized, oh my God, this was rampant. It was sexual abuse, it was spiritual abuse, it was mental abuse, just his lecturing and yelling, and that would go on for hours and hours.
Was your mother aware of this?
My mother was aware, and she was passive and scared, and she had had a tyrannical father, and she married a man who was tyrannical.
Oh, dear.
And it wasn't until I left home that she finally broke away, and she left the marriage with one of my brothers, and the other brother stayed with my dad. And then it took her a long time to get her voice, and she really did get her voice, and she became a probation officer, and then she eventually became a child protective officer, and realized that she had not known how to protect us, and that became her work to protect children who were being abused. So that has certainly been one of my most vivid experiences, someone cleaning up their karma.
Yeah. Now, the end of George's question, though, was that your father acknowledged his inappropriate behavior with you, and then he took it back?
Right. A week later, he called, and I picked up the phone. It was like, "Oh, hi, Daddy. I'm so glad to hear you." And he was back in a rage. And he raged at me for half an hour. And I was so stunned and shocked. He said, "You stupid, ridiculous, I can't remember, woman. How could you do this to a dying man? How could you be so cruel and so devastating? It's lies." And it took me half an hour to realize I don't have to be yelled at ever again. And I just said, "I'm done." And I hung up the phone. And I never spoke to him again. And he died about 3 months later.
And did he die with anybody? I mean, did he have any of his previous family or friends or...
He went into a hospice 3 days before he died, and I met the nurse who was with him when he died. So even when he was dying, he was still his charismatic self. And she said she still remembered him or was impacted by having been his nurse those last 3 days, that she looked me up, and she was on vacation in Maine, and she wanted to come and meet me and tell me about his last 3 days. She said he was so present and so alive and so passionate and so connecting. And he said, "I've messed up and destroyed a lot in my life, and I'm ready to die." And she was right with him. And they were playing jazz. They were playing his favorite jazz for him. And
Wow.
then what was really beautiful is my youngest brother called him because he had heard that he was dying. He called him, and the nurse put the phone next to him. And my brother just talked to him. And my dad at that point was probably in a coma, but the nurse said he opened his eyes when he heard your voice. And my brother talked to him about the fun times they had, the adventures they had driving in his Jaguar and sailing together and meals they had had. And then he finished talking, and he was just quiet, and then the nurse came on the line and said he died.
Oh, man.
And this was in 94.
Yeah. So there was someone who saw who he was, and then my brother was talking to him. And that I had always thought I would be there, the one, but I had reached my limit.
Yeah.
So I'm so grateful my brother was there. And then I had this extraordinary experience after he died, and when I heard that he had died, I felt this rush of joy that he was released from the suffering that he had lived in and that his spirit was free. And I had never understood that concept of being free at last, and that we were free and we were safe.
Does he ever show up in your dreams?
Yes, he does.
Is he nice?
I've had some remarkable dreams with him where he showed up. Yeah, I felt like I've written my dreams down for years, and I've continued to have, and I would read and when I was writing the book 20 years later, he started showing up in my dreams again.
Oh, man.
This is such a powerful set of experiences, Elizabeth. What took you a while to write the book? What did you have to get through in your own life to be able to put the book together?
For a while, I felt like I had to put up a wall to my childhood, and I didn't want to think about it, and I didn't want to talk about it. And then I did years of therapy. I did a lot of therapy. And then I felt pretty peaceful, and I was concentrated on my life and my children's life. And then my youngest daughter had left home. And what's interesting is my father had atrial fibrillation, where his heart would just race really fast. And my brothers and I inherited this. And mine had become so persistent, I had to have a surgery called an ablation to correct it. And when I was recovering from that, and I was isolated, I was by myself, I felt like I regressed to being a child. and I would wake out of a dream, and I would have these vivid experiences of being a little girl in the village where I grew up. And then I would write them down. And each day I would have a new memory, and I would write it down in that child's voice. And I remembered being the little girl who adored her father, and I remembered us driving in his Jaguar with the top down around Christmas, and it's snowing, and looking up in the branches and seeing the snow. So it was over the next 2 years, I kept writing every day, and I felt like I was reliving my childhood. And as my child got older, and I moved to being like a 13-year-old with my perspective then, and then 15, and then 17, and then I went from living in our old Victorian farmhouse to living in the glass house and remembering what it was like. And I kept writing until I'd written every memory I had of essentially my childhood. And then I worked with an editor because I said, I don't know what this is. It's a big mess. It was this huge document. And she said, well, where the energy is it's about you and your dad, and that this is a memoir about growing up as an architect's daughter. So I ended up working on it. From the time I started, I had the heart surgery, to when it came out was 10 years. And I wrote for a really concentrated time, and then I went back to Cincinnati, and then I started doing research on architecture, and then I started finding architects my dad had worked with and who had been his co-op students. I had amazing conversations with architects. And then I rediscovered my love of modernism and rediscovered that language that I had learned as a child and relearned it as an adult. And then I had to restudy the Corbusier designs and the Villa Savoye, and then to write these chapters, I had to immerse myself in all those things. So it was coming around full circle and healing that incredible crevasse of that time where I had to just wall my father out. Oh, and really early on, I had this voice come to me that said, of my dad, like in a dream, saying, don't remember just what was bad, remember what was good. And that's what I did. I got to remember what was remarkable. And I remember going to a therapist at some point while I was working on this, going, why am I writing all of this? And my mother said, I don't know how you can write anything about that horrid man. He was just a horrible, horrible person. But my therapist helped me. She said, if you make the lens wide enough that you can see the whole cultural picture of what he grew up in, the pressure of the change of the eras, then it will all fit. And then you can see the tragedy, and you can see the magic, and then you can see your childhood, and you can see the breaking away, and then it's a full portrait. And I healed so much writing this, and I also feel like it helped I've met a lot of children of architects who also lived in houses where it looked exactly like the picture of our house on the cover of the book, and where their fathers picked out everything they wore, all the design and furniture in the house, the art. It was like...
Everything
like,
you wore?
It was the whole Frank Lloyd Wright style of architecture, where the architect would choose the entire lifestyle of the vibe of the house.
He chose all of my mother's clothes, her jewelry.
Really?
He chose my jewelry.
Did he pack your lunch?
No, but he did, help design what our menus were for dinner parties.
Oh, my goodness.
Everything was an aesthetic event.
Elizabeth, while your dad's life was imploding, this dorm that he designed in Cincinnati also was destroyed at a fairly young age. Why did they get rid of it?
Well, from the first day the students started moving in, within the first day and a half, all the modern furniture that he had chosen for the dorm lobbies and places for kids to hang out and converse, all of it was stripped and stolen by students and people in the neighborhood and carried off campus. So
it's like looted?
It was looted. And a lot of people go, well, what did the campus police do? Well, they had a brand new college president who didn't want to do anything that would start a riot.
Right.
So the campus police didn't do anything.
This was just a year after Kent State.
It opened
in 71?
September 1971. Everyone was treading very carefully and not wanting to start a riot, so they just let the students carry away the furniture. And then what was interesting is the students the vibe around campus when this building was being built was they hated it. It was like a symbol of the man, the symbol of authority bearing down on them. And they were being required to live on campus in that dormitory and other dormitories. And kids wanted to live off campus, and they wanted to live cheaply and crummy housing, and they were required to live in this big dormitory. And they couldn't open the windows, and they hated that. Oh, and there had been fires in a dormitory at Ohio State.
At Ohio State, yeah, in the towers.
Right, and students had died of, I think 2 or 3 co-ed students had died of smoke inhalation.
Oh, no.
So there was a battle leading up to the opening of Sanders Hall of whether it was safe. And I remember seeing hippies around campus pointing at the building before it was opened and saying, there are going to be fires. People are going to die there.
Well, and I would think that because they had to turn the glass around and this killed the energy-saving aspect of the windows, it must have been really hot in there. Because I bet the AC was set up for a certain amount of insulation.
They had to re-engineer all the air conditioning so that it was a decent temperature in there. But students hated they couldn't open the windows. And students started lighting fires. And people would ball up papers from within the first year. There were robberies, there were rapes, and there were fires.
That's so sad.
And people partied like crazy. There was a big article about when my book came out. There was a 3 or 4 page spread in the University of Cincinnati Alumni Magazine, including an excerpt from the book and also a history of the book. And they said what's amazing, the editor for the Alumni Journal said they get more reactions to articles about Sanders Hall than anything else they ever write about, because so many people lived in it, because it was 3,000 students a year.
Yeah, big building.
And it was crazy, and it had these incredible views. So some people loved it, some people hated it. It had super speed elevators taking people to higher floors and lower floors. But kids would start lighting fires, and sometimes it got to the point, I think by the 5th or 6th year, that it was every night there were fires. Or people would throw the fire alarm, and kids just started ignoring them. And finally, I think at about year 9 or year 10, there was a fire and there was a lot of smoke, and there was a girl in her dorm room, and she used one of her chairs and smashed open one of the glass windows. And it was high enough that the fire department could barely reach her and get her out, and then they closed the building. So the building was only in operation, was it 9 or 11 years, something like that. And then it was closed and empty for the next 9 years. So it went from being this crazy party building where people lived nearby. You could see lights on all night and partying and music and loud. And then it was empty. And then I've heard tales since about people sneaking in the building and lighting fires and exploring all through the dark building. And then they decided after that they should either renovate it and add a double set of stairways to bring it up to modern code. It was built to code when it was built, but then code changed. Or it was cheaper to tear it down and build a new building.
And what year was it torn down?
It was built in 71. It was imploded in 91.
So your dad was around when it imploded.
So he was around, and he met up with the head guy who had been the head engineer for the building. And they had fought for the years leading up to it. They had fought and responded to attacks of it all the time it was open. And they went out on this head engineer's boat out in the Ohio River. And there was a place where if you were right on the river in the right place, you could see the top, like 4 or 5 stories of Sanders Hall, way up on the bluff at University of Cincinnati. And they were there where thousands and thousands of people clustered all around UC to watch it imploded. So it was this cool thing. They were going to blow up this building, and my dad and the engineer were out on the river. So they didn't hear it. They just saw it disappear in a puff of smoke. And you can go online, and you can see the implosion of, thousands and thousands of people have watched over and over the implosion of Sanders Hall. It's fascinating. It's like this cultural thing. People would say, how kids growing up in the 60s would say, where were you when JFK was killed? People in Cincinnati would go, where were you? Where did you see Sanders Hall blown up?
Wow.
It was a wild thing. So in a way, it echoed my dad's huge personality. And he built this building that he was absolutely convinced would be remarkable for the students, and then it turned into this battlefield.
Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining us. I can tell that you are the poet laureate of Belfast because your book is so well written, and of course now, hearing you, you really know how to tell a story.
Yeah.
Thank you. It was funny because I've been writing this other book. I started rereading sections from it today and was going, wow, I did a good job. Well, thank you so much. This was delightful to talk to you both, and it's so great to get to talk about and re-enter and settle back into this story again.
The book is Implosion, a memoir of an architect's daughter. And now a few minutes with Frank Harmon, author of Native Places.
An epiphany in a sandwich shop. Blessed are the ordinary, a church sign said on Highway 52 outside Lake City, South Carolina. There are lots of church signs on Highway 52, and I've seen them all. God knows I've seen so many fast food joints, CVS stores, used car lots, and dollar stores that plaster roads like Highway 52 that I don't even notice them anymore. But this time was different. I noticed things I hadn't seen. A barnyard laid out symmetrically like a Renaissance villa, but instead of marble statues of gods and goddesses, it had John Deere highboy tractors. A little girl who had carefully set up a miniature dressing table in the grass beside her family's trailer in a mildewed trailer park, a place where you'd want to keep your doors locked. The dressing table mirror reflected the sky. And a Subway artist on Tuna Tuesday who pulled little scraps of food onto the counter to remember what her phone customers ordered. The farmer, the little girl, and the sandwich maker all had the ability to make something blessed out of the ordinary. One could say the same about a poet. One could say the same of love.
Thanks for listening. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Angela Roll, your special real estate agent for Modernist houses. Okay, Tom, wrap us up.
Visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to listen to past shows, discover documentation of 7,500 significant modernist houses, and access 3 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song was performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. Carrie Cesarino researches our guests while juggling 2 children, a crocodile, and a freshly baked blueberry pie. I bet that's hot.
Yum.
All while dancing the beguine with her husband, Adam. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild. George and I'll be back soon with another compelling ripped from the Greek mythology headlines edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.